So, the first panel in this second central series is undoubtedly the most famous panel of Michelangelo's ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, which art historians have incorrectly decided to title The Creation of Adam, or The Creation of Man. Michelangelo never called it that. He never would have called it that. If anything, he would have called it one side of a coin that we could call the creation of humanity. When you're in the Sistine Chapel and you're viewing the ceiling, you're viewing it as it was always intended to be viewed. That is, from the ground looking up. It's only with modern photography that we can blow images up and see things we might otherwise miss. If you put something into writing, like the Catholic priest Martin Luther will do 5 years after Michelangelo finishes this ceiling, you can get nailed for it. But if you're an artist or an architect, you can hide things. And these guys did this all the time, as we're about to see. So, 5,000 square feet, 464 square meters of painted plaster, which Michelangelo did all by himself in 4 years, under complete secrecy. The first thing the man ever painted in his life, at least a fresco. He intentionally left about 4 square centimeters or 4 square inches or 10 square centimeters of plaster not painted. If you look at the image of this panel, Adam's eyeball, it's just bare plaster, no paint. Moreover, you'll notice if you look more carefully, and of course, under this and several other images on your worksheets, you have a link where you can actually go to the particular site on the internet and blow the images up for yourselves if you wish. You'll notice that he left actually a few inches or several centimeters of space between the fingertips of Adam and God. They're not touching, because for Michelangelo, this is his photographic snapshot of the split second right before God puts the spark of life, not chronologically first into Adam, meaning man, meaning male, and then into Eve, meaning woman, meaning female. Rather, which is what the book of Genesis says, rather for Michelangelo, it's a simultaneous act. And so, if I were to suggest to you that that big flowing cape behind God is actually a human organ, which organ in the human body do you think it looks like? I guess some suggest maybe a uterus, a womb, maybe somewhat. A heart, okay, a little farther up. It's the cross section of a human brain. In other words, in the eternal mind of God, right, in creating humanity, as we just suggested, at least for Michelangelo, God never intends to create one sex before the other, whichever that may be. Rather, it's a simultaneous act. And so, if you look more closely into that eternal mind of God, you will see for yourselves resting in God's left arm, Eve, already in the eternal mind of God from all eternity. Moreover, you'll notice that Eve is looking through the eyes of God into the still lifeless eyeball of Adam. In other words, Adam here is not yet alive, hence the unpainted eyeball. Because again, for Michelangelo, humanity is not humanity unless it's Adam and Eve, or for that matter, Eve and Adam. And so the next panel in this central series is the flip side of that coin, the so-called creation of Eve. A couple of things. One, it's interesting to note that if you look at Eve, according to the book of Genesis, God draws Eve forth from the rib, physically the side of Adam. But if you look closely at this image, if you zoom in on it, you'll notice she's not stepping out of the side, the rib physically of Adam. Rather, she also is stepping out of the abyss, the darkness, the shadow cast behind Adam. Secondly, it is this panel, the creation, so-called creation of Eve, which Michelangelo most centrally locates in the entire ceiling, giving this panel the most prominent placement. Maybe a few different reasons for that. One, Eve, the archetype of divine wisdom, woman, female, Sophia. Secondly, the archetype of the church itself, which follows from, actually, it should be 2 and 3, but point number 3, the role of Mary, who in the Christian tradition winds up becoming the mother of God, Theotokos, because Mary is the mother of Jesus Christ. In any event, this is the most centrally placed panel in the entire ceiling. The third panel, then, in this central series are actually 2 scenes in one. On the left side, you will see the temptation and fall in the Garden of Eden. On the right side, the consequences of the fall, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. First of all, if you compare the physical forms of Adam and Eve before the fall and after the fall, there's a big difference. Before the fall, they look like they just walked off the cover of Muscle and Fitness magazine, or at least the 16th century equivalent. The human bodies are physically very robust, healthy. After the fall, it looks like they've been out several nights in a row on pub crawls. The human body is physically diminished, right? For Michelangelo, the human person is holistic. Everything's connected: mind, heart, soul, spirit, physical body. In other words, what one does in one realm of one's life has consequences and effects in the others as well. By taking the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve transgress God's command not to do so, and so are expelled from the garden. Another couple of things here. Prior to this depiction, Michelangelo's depiction here of the temptation and fall in the Garden of Eden, previous artists in the Christian tradition, when they tried to depict this scene, either in painting or sculpture, either Adam is not literally in the picture, which is what the book of Genesis says, or you see him rather gratuitously sort of pushing Eve's hand away from taking the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, as if to say, oh no, Eve, don't do it. Don't you know that the consequences will be horrible? Because the idea at the time is that the fall in the Garden of Eden is the fault of Eve. Here, Michelangelo is something very different. You see Eve seemingly willingly taking the fruit from the Satan, the tempter wrapped around the tree, to which we're going to come in a moment. But you see Adam not only pulling back a tree limb, but on his own reaching for one of the fruits of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, a collaboration between the sexes in the fall, this original sin. A collaboration between the sexes. Radical idea in the early 16th century. If you look at the Satan, the adversary, Satan, in the tree, you'll notice, as the book of Genesis says, that the body is in fact serpentine. It's a serpent wrapped around the tree trunk. However, its torso and head are humanoid. It's a human. Artistically, again, Michelangelo, he did not like depicting animals, be it in sculpture or in painting. Again, for Michelangelo, the height of God's creation, its masterpiece is the human person, the human being, the human form. But there may be something else going on here. If you zoom in on the face of the tempter, Satan, wrapped around that tree, zoom in on its face. You've already seen it in a previous panel. If you go back to the so-called creation of Adam, the first panel in this central series, and you zoom in on the image of God, you will see just behind the figure of Eve, resting in God's left arm, that very same face, whispering into the left, sinistra, sinister. Sinister means left, but then we get evil from this. You'll see that very same face, the face of Satan, whispering into the ear of Eve, already planting the seed, if you will, of what is about to happen. Finally, look at that tree in the Garden of Eden. You know what species of tree that is? You can tell by looking at its leaves what kind of a tree it is. It's a fig tree. A fig tree. This is very interesting because the book of Genesis never says that it's a particular species of fruit tree or any other species of tree. Birch, ash, oak, pine. The book of Genesis says that it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A lot of Christian art and even the popular imagination, people just kind of think, oh, it was an apple tree. And you see this depicted in Christian art, an apple. This is a fig tree. There's a reason for that. In ancient Latin, and this is continued in Italian, the Italian language in contemporary culture to this day, the term for fig has a double meaning. Figo, figa in Italian, ficus in Latin, but figo, figa. Use your imagination here. Figo is a dried fig. Figa is a sliced, open, freshly cut fig. And in ancient Rome, in Latin, and still today in Italian, there's a double entendre, a double meaning here. Yeah. A dried fig refers to the male genitalia, particularly the penis. A fresh fig, sliced open, refers to the female genitalia. In the 5th century, the early 5th century, St. Augustine of Hippo is the first to introduce the idea that the original sin committed in the Garden of Eden was somehow sexual in nature. Consequently, Michelangelo's implementation of this particular device in his visual representation of this moment. Very interesting. Okay. With that, on the right side of the panel, finally, we said Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. They have children. Their son Cain murders their other son Abel. Things rapidly deteriorate, and finally God says, wow, I'm God and all, but I really blew this one. So I'm going to pretend like nothing ever happened, wipe it all out, and start over. How? By sending a flood. And so the last 3 panels in this 3-part, 3-paneled series in the ceiling are highlights from the famous flood story in the book of Genesis. The first of these 3 panels, the first 2 of these 3 panels, they're reversed for technical reasons on the part of Michelangelo. There's a lot of theories about this, even symbolism. It was for technical reasons he screwed up, he messed up. He changed his mind. In any event, the story flows. So technically, in terms of the flood story in the book of Genesis, of these last 3 panels, the first panel is actually the second one. So you see Noah's Ark in the background, the flood waters are receding, people are arriving onto dry land. The first panel in the series, which is chronologically after in the story book, the book of Genesis, you see the sacrifice of Noah. So you see Noah at the altar of sacrifice. Because why? They've just been delivered from the flood. God was going to wipe everything out with a flood, which he did. However, God was probably thinking, damn it. There was one guy on earth, Noah, that said, well, I listen to you, Lord. I'll do whatever you say. So God said, okay, build an ark. I'm going to send a flood right out the storm, 40 days and 40 nights, then you'll find dry land. And Noah listened, as the story goes. They're delivered from the flood. And how do you thank the gods in the ancient world? By performing a sacrifice. And so you see the sacrifice of Noah is at the altar. You see his son in the foreground kneeling in front of the altar over a ram which has just been slaughtered. He's passing its organs, its innards up to the altar where Noah is immolating, burning them on the altar, pointing up towards the divine, towards God, reminding everyone that we're doing this precisely because God has saved us. God has remained faithful to God's promises to us. Maybe we should now do the same toward God. Remain faithful to God. And then what happens? The 9th and final panel here in the ceiling. Noah gets plastered. The drunkenness of Noah. You see Noah just kind of splayed, was all like spread eagle, all out there. It's all hanging out, junk all over the place. His three sons are trying to cover up his shame, his nakedness, right? The idea being that when it's all said and done, humanity falls again. Not because Noah got blitzed, but because already Noah has miscalculated. He's confused God for God's creation and has consequently abused it. And now he's disillusioned. The drunkenness of Noah. Again, the idea is that humanity falls again and again and again. This is going to obviously be a rather dialectical, repetitive pattern throughout the rest of human history, which finally brings us, in looking at the ceiling, all of those very large figures on the sides of the ceiling, these large human bodies that are kind of sideways with respect to these 9 panels along the center of the ceiling. And these are all of the great prophets from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, and the oracles and sibyls from ancient Greece and Rome. So, for example, you'll see their names written beneath them. Like on your worksheets, you'll see the oracle at Delphi, who famously told Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC that he would conquer the world. Or on the right side, in this case, the particular prophet Isaiah in Latin, Isaiah, right? Probably the most famous prophet of all the prophets of the Old Testament, foretelling the eventual coming of this suffering servant figure, a savior figure, a Messiah figure, right? In any event, in all their writings, Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, Greek and Roman oracles and sibyls of the ancient world, in all their writings, what they're doing is they're contemplating, looking at these 9 panels in the center, they're contemplating the story of creation and what went wrong. And in all their writings, prophets, oracles, sibyls, they always either very clearly, directly, or somehow indirectly, surreptitiously foreshadow, foretell, mention the eventual coming someday of someone who will go back to that moment in the Garden of Eden, the fall in the Garden of Eden, and undo what was then done. A new Adam and a new Eve, which in the Christian tradition winds up becoming Jesus Christ, the new Adam, and his mother Mary, the new Eve. When this was unveiled in 1512, remember I said it was done in complete secrecy. Not even Pope Julius II knew what Michelangelo was doing. When Pope Julius II saw this, he was furious. He was furious. He was expecting what at the time would have been a kind of a standard, typical, stereotypical, really, Last Supper scene, Jesus and the 12 apostles. But when he saw this, he was furious. And he came this close to having the whole thing torn down. The only thing that prevented him from doing so was that he dropped dead. So maybe there is a God. Just kidding. Also, I would like to just add as an aside, there's so much we could cover in this, but of course, it's beyond our purposes in the course, at least these courses. I said he worked 4 years. During those 4 years, Michelangelo worked so those of you who are finding perhaps It painful to follow these lecture sessions. Michelangelo, to do this, worked 6 days a week, 15 hours a day, usually at night. And for the entire project, in today's US dollars, he was paid the equivalent of about $100,000, $100,000, spread out over 4 years. And it was his only source of income because he had no time for anything else. So a starving artist, indeed. In any event, transitioning to the next masterpiece we're going to now look at, the rooms of Raffaello. When this project was unveiled, finally, 1512, Raffaello, the famous great rival of Michelangelo, fell into a great, deep depression. Raffaello already could not stand Michelangelo. Michelangelo famously at the time had a very difficult character, to say the least. He did not like people at all. Raffaello falls into this depression, however, because when these two projects are unveiled, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo, and Raffaello's private office room for the same Pope Julius II, who commissioned both Michelangelo and Raffaello to work on these projects simultaneously. Raffaello falls into this depression because now, when the two projects are unveiled, the undisputed better painter is no longer the more famous of the two at the time, who, as chief architect of the Vatican, only drew, drafted, and painted Raffaello, but the sculptor, Michelangelo. We think, and by we I mean me, although I'm not the only one, but we think that Raffaello got over this depression, his anger and hostility towards Michelangelo, with a little help from none other than Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo, who, when he heard about these projects, decided to come here to Rome, to the Vatican, to see them for himself. More on that later. In any event, with that, we are now going to begin our lecture session on the most famous of these rooms of Raffaello.